A Game of Capos. Francesca Barone had spent her life knowing the rules, knowing that some men were untouchable. But when Lorenzo De Luca kissed her in the dark, his hands gripping her like a claim, she forgot every single one. And now, as their families prepared for war, she felt his presence behind her, his voice a whisper against her skin. "You should have walked away," he murmured, "because now I don't plan on letting you go." Chapter 1. The Whispers of a Forbidden Touch. The air in the dimly lit backroom of Il Sogno was thick with the scent of aged grappa and expensive cigars. Francesca Barone inhaled deeply, trying to quell the tremor in her hands. She smoothed the silk of her emerald green dress, a futile attempt to project an image of calm she was far from feeling. Around her, the men of her family, the Barone, one of the oldest and most respected and feared families in Naples, spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Her brother, Marco, his face a mask of grim determination, gestured emphatically with a thick, gold-ringed hand. Her uncle, Salvatore, a man whose eyes held the cold steel of a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous waters of the Camorra, listened intently, his face etched with lines of worry that even years of practiced composure couldn't hide. Francesca, at 58, had seen enough of these gatherings to understand the gravity of the situation. The De Luca family, their long-standing rivals, were making a move. Territory, power, respect, the usual dance of blood and ambition that had defined their world for generations. She had always been on the periphery, the dutiful daughter, the quiet observer. Marriage to a respectable, if uninspiring, man chosen by her father. A life lived within the gilded cage of tradition. A life she had accepted, until recently, until him. The memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the haze of anxiety. 6 months ago, at the annual Festa di San Gennaro, a celebration that, ironically, was meant to foster unity amongst the families. She had stepped away from the boisterous crowd, seeking a moment of solitude in the labyrinthine alleyways behind the cathedral. The air had been thick with the scent of jasmine and roasting chestnuts. And then he had appeared. Lorenzo De Luca. The name itself was a whisper of danger, a forbidden fruit. He was everything she was not supposed to want. Tall, with a lean, powerful build honed from years spent enforcing his family's will. Hair the color of midnight, eyes that held the same dark intensity, yet flickered with something else. Something that drew her in, a moth to a dangerous flame. He had been standing in the shadows, a cigarette dangling carelessly from his lips, the cherry-red glow illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He hadn't spoken at first, just looked at her. A look that stripped away the years, the pretense, the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart. A look that saw her, not the Barone daughter, but the woman beneath. The woman who yearned for something more, something real. Then, he had moved, closing the distance between them with a predatory grace that both thrilled and terrified her. He had reached out, his hand gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. He had leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "Francesca," he had murmured, her name a caress on his lips. A name no one in his world should have uttered to her, with that intonation. She had known, even then, that it was a mistake. A dangerous game. But the pull was too strong, the allure of the forbidden too intoxicating. She had tilted her head back, meeting his gaze, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. And then he had kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of possession, of hunger, of a desperate need that mirrored her own. His hands had gripped her waist, pulling her flesh against him, the hard planes of his body a stark contrast to the softness of hers. She had lost herself in the moment, in the taste of him, in the feel of his strong arms around her. It was a kiss that shattered the foundations of her world, a kiss that promised both ecstasy and ruin. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He hadn't said anything, just held her gaze for a long, breathless moment before disappearing back into the shadows, leaving her trembling and breathless, forever changed. Now, 6 months later, the consequences of that stolen moment were looming large. The whispers of war between their families were growing louder, the tension thicker. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the kiss had not been a mere dalliance for him. It had been a declaration, a challenge. A movement caught her eye. Marco was looking at her, his expression softening slightly. He had always been protective of her, even after their father's death 5 years ago. He knew about her loveless marriage, the quiet desperation that had settled in her soul. He probably suspected something about Lorenzo, too. The men of their world were perceptive, especially when it came to matters of the heart, or matters of betrayal. "Francesca," he said, his voice low and laced with concern. "You should go home. It's not safe for you to be here." She nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. She wanted to stay, to be a part of the discussions, to understand the intricacies of the brewing conflict. But she knew her place. She was a woman in a man's world, a pawn in a deadly game. As she rose to leave, her gaze swept across the room, lingering on the faces of the men who held her fate, and the fate of her family, in their hands. She wondered if Lorenzo was in a similar room somewhere, surrounded by his own family, planning their next move. She wondered if he ever thought of her, of the kiss that had ignited a firestorm between them. Outside, the Neapolitan night air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the back room. The city was alive with the sounds of laughter, music, and the distant rumble of traffic. It was a world that seemed a million miles away from the clandestine meetings and the looming threat of violence. As she walked towards her car, a sleek, black Alfa Romeo that was both a symbol of her status and a cage on wheels, she felt a presence behind her. A familiar shiver ran down her spine. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He was there, a shadow in the darkness, his scent, a mix of expensive cologne and something darker, more primal, filling her senses. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. "You should have walked away," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant whisper against her skin, sending a fresh wave of heat through her. His hands, strong and possessive, gently gripped her upper arms, the contact both a reassurance and a threat. "Because now," he continued, his voice dropping to a husky murmur, "I don't plan on letting you go." Chapter 2. Shadows lengthen on cobblestone streets. Francesca turned slowly, her body trembling slightly under Lorenzo's touch. The streetlights cast long, dancing shadows on the narrow, cobblestone street, painting the scene in a chiaroscuro of light and darkness that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. He stood close, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint trace of tobacco clinging to his expensive wool coat. His eyes, usually dark and impenetrable, held a flicker of something vulnerable, something that reached out to the hidden depths within her. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the city. It wasn't a question, nor an accusation. Just his name, spoken like a prayer, a plea, a confession. He didn't release her. Instead, his grip tightened, almost imperceptibly, but enough to send a jolt of awareness through her. "You knew this would happen, Francesca," he said, his voice low and rough, like velvet over steel. "You knew the moment our lips touched that we were crossing a line that neither of us can uncross." She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Fear, desire, regret, a desperate longing for something she couldn't name. He was right. She had known. She had chosen to ignore the warnings, the ingrained rules, the inherent danger. She had chosen to taste the forbidden fruit, and now she was paying the price. "Our families," she began, her voice trailing off. The words felt hollow, inadequate. The feud between the Barone and the De Luca families was ancient, a tapestry woven with threads of betrayal, bloodshed, and vengeance. It was a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Lorenzo's lips curved into a sardonic smile. "Our families," he echoed, his voice laced with a hint of bitterness. "They would see us both dead before they allowed this connection to exist." He paused, his gaze searching hers. But I don't care about them, Francesca. Not anymore. His words sent a shiver of both fear and exhilaration through her. It was a declaration of war, not just against their families, but against the very fabric of their world. A world where loyalty was paramount, where tradition reigned supreme, where love was a weakness to be exploited. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lorenzo," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to pull away, but his grip held firm. "And you're not?" he countered, his eyes challenging her. "You think I didn't see the way you looked at me, Francesca? The way you responded to my kiss? You're not the dutiful, obedient Barone daughter anymore. You're something more." His words struck a chord within her, a truth she had been trying to deny. The kiss had awakened something within her, a yearning for a life beyond the confines of her gilded cage. A life where she could be free to choose, to love, to be herself. "I don't know what I am anymore," she admitted, her voice choked with emotion. The years of suppressed desires, of quiet desperation, were rising to the surface, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for so long. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and unwavering. Then slowly he released her. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely bereft, exposed. "Then let me show you," he said, his voice softening. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, sending a fresh wave of heat through her. "Let me show you who you are, Francesca. Let me show you what we could be together." The temptation was almost overwhelming. To surrender to the pull, to abandon herself to the dangerous, intoxicating allure of this forbidden love. To risk everything for a chance at something real, something more. But the reality of their situation was inescapable. Their families were on the brink of war. The streets of Naples were about to become a battleground. And they were on opposite sides. "It's impossible," she whispered, her voice filled with a desperate longing that mirrored his own. "Our families, they'll never allow it." "Then we won't ask for their permission," he said, his voice hardening. He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. "We'll take what we want, Francesca. We'll create our own world, our own rules." His words were both a promise and a threat. A promise of a love that defied the boundaries of their world, a threat to the established order, to everything she had ever known. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear was still there, but it was mingled with a growing sense of defiance, of a reckless abandon she hadn't felt in years. A sudden noise, the screech of tires, broke the spell. A black car, similar to her own, pulled up beside them, its headlights illuminating the scene in a harsh, unforgiving glare.
"Marco."
Lorenzo stepped back, his expression instantly hardening, his eyes turning cold and wary. The moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced by the mask of the Camorra prince he was born to be. Marco got out of the car, his face a mask of fury. He didn't say anything, just looked at Lorenzo with a mixture of hatred and contempt. The tension between them was palpable, a silent battle of wills. Francesca felt the wave of despair wash over her. This was it.
The end.
The fragile bubble of hope that had been building within her was about to burst. Marco turned to her, his voice tight with anger. "Get in the car, Francesca."
"Now."
She hesitated, her gaze locking with Lorenzo's. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible. A silent farewell? Or a promise of things to come?
She didn't know.
With a heavy heart, she turned and walked towards the car, leaving Lorenzo standing alone in the shadows, the whispers of a forbidden love echoing in the night air. The weight of what she had just almost chosen, and what she was forced to leave behind felt suffocating. Chapter 3. The Weight of Family Crests. The ride back to the Barone estate was a suffocating silence, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and Marco's tense breathing. Francesca sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the blurring cityscape. The lights of Naples, usually a source of comfort and familiarity, now seemed to mock her, a reminder of the vibrant life she was excluded from. The Barone estate, A sprawling villa perched on a hill overlooking the Bay of Naples was a fortress of tradition and power. Ancient stone walls, adorned with intricate carvings, and the imposing Barone family crest, a snarling wolf's head, stood guard against the outside world. Inside, the villa was a labyrinth of opulent rooms, filled with antique furniture, priceless artwork, and the ghosts of generations past. It was a beautiful prison, a gilded cage that had always felt both suffocating and secure. As they pulled into the long, winding driveway, lined with towering cypress trees, Francesca felt a familiar sense of dread settle over her. She knew what awaited her. A reckoning. Marco parked the car in front of the massive, oak-carved front doors and turned to her, his expression grim. "You were reckless, Francesca," he said, his voice low and laced with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "You know the rules. You know the danger." She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and shame. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lorenzo De Luca is not a man to be trifled with," Marco continued, his hand gripping the steering wheel tightly. "He's dangerous, Francesca. He's untouchable." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Untouchable. Not just because of his family, his power, his ruthlessness, but because of the ancient code, the unwritten laws that governed their world. A Barone did not consort with a De Luca. It was a betrayal of everything they stood for. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was the truth, but it sounded weak, even to her own ears. Marco sighed, his anger seeming to dissipate slightly, replaced by a weary resignation. "I know you didn't," he said, his voice softening. "But that doesn't change the fact that it did happen. And now we have to deal with the consequences." He got out of the car and opened her door, his hand outstretched to help her out. She took it, his touch surprisingly gentle. He led her inside, through the grand foyer, with its soaring ceilings and marble floors, and into the family study. The study was Uncle Salvatore's domain. It was a room filled with a scent of old leather, pipe tobacco, and the weight of countless decisions that had shaped the Barone family's destiny. Salvatore was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. He looked up as they entered, his eyes, sharp and assessing, taking in the scene before him. "Francesca," he said, his voice calm and measured, but with an underlying steeliness that sent a shiver down her spine.
"Sit down."
She obeyed, sinking into one of the plush leather armchairs facing the desk. Marco remained standing, his presence a silent, protective force behind her. Salvatore leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her. "Tell me," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tell me everything." And so she did. She told him about the encounter at the Festa di San Gennaro, about the stolen kiss, about the meeting tonight. She held nothing back, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a strange sense of liberation. It was the first time she had spoken openly about her feelings for Lorenzo, about the conflict that was tearing her apart. Salvatore listened intently, his expression unchanging. When she was finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. The only sound in the room was the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner, each tick marking the passage of time, the weight of the unspoken. Finally, he spoke. "You understand the gravity of the situation, Francesca?" he asked, his voice still calm, but with a hint of warning. She nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Yes," she whispered. "The De Luca family are our enemies," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "They have been for generations. There is no room for sentimentality. There is only loyalty. Loyalty to your family, to your blood." His words were a stark reminder of the world she inhabited, a world where love was a luxury they could not afford, a world where family was everything, where duty and honor outweighed personal desires. "I know," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. But even as she said the words, a part of her rebelled. A part of her yearned for something more, something beyond the confines of tradition and obligation. Salvatore sighed, his expression softening slightly. He looked at Marco, then back at Francesca. "You are a Barone," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You have always been a dutiful daughter, a loyal member of this family. I know you will not dishonor us." His words were not a question, but a command. A command disguised as a statement of faith. He was giving her a chance, a way out. A chance to return to the fold, to reaffirm her loyalty, to renounce the forbidden desires that threatened to consume her. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. She knew what was expected of her. She knew what she should do. But as she opened her mouth to speak, to utter the words of submission, of obedience, she hesitated. The image of Lorenzo's face, his eyes filled with a mixture of passion and defiance, flashed before her. The memory of his kiss, the feel of his arms around her, the whisper of his voice against her skin, sent a wave of longing through her. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. The weight of the family crest, the weight of generations of tradition, of expectation, pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. But beneath that weight, a spark of rebellion flickered. A spark of hope. A spark of a love that refused to be extinguished. Could she truly go back to the life she'd had, now that Lorenzo had shown her what was possible? Could she deny the fire that had been ignited? The crest felt heavier than it ever had before, the snarling wolf seeming to glare down at her, a constant reminder of the invisible chains binding her. She felt, at that moment, less like a wolf and more like a caged bird. Chapter 4. A dance beneath a treacherous moon. The silence in the study stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken expectations. Francesca could feel Marco's gaze on her, a silent plea for her to do the right thing, the expected thing. Salvatore's eyes, though seemingly calm, held a depth of understanding that both comforted and terrified her. He knew the battle raging within her, the struggle between duty and desire, between loyalty and love. Finally, she opened her eyes, meeting Salvatore's gaze directly. She began, her voice trembling, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to say the right thing, to reassure them, to promise to forget Lorenzo, to return to the life she had always known. But the words wouldn't come. The truth, raw and undeniable, was a lump in her throat, refusing to be swallowed. Salvatore leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Francesca," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "Speak your mind. Do not be afraid." His words, unexpectedly kind, were like a key unlocking a door she had kept firmly shut for years. "The dam broke. I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice choked with emotion, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I know what I should do. I know what is expected of me. But I can't just forget him. I can't pretend that kiss never happened. It changed everything." Marco shifted uncomfortably, his hand reaching out as if to comfort her, but then stopping short, as if realizing the futility of the gesture. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, the depth of her loneliness, the quiet desperation that had haunted her for years. Salvatore remained silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then, he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of generations of Barone history. "Love," he said, his voice laced with a hint of sadness, "is a dangerous thing in our world, Francesca. It can be a weakness, a vulnerability that our enemies will exploit. It can lead to ruin. But it can also be a strength," Francesca countered, her voice gaining a newfound firmness, fueled by a desperate hope. "It can be a reason to fight, a reason to live." Salvatore's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected this defiance, this passion. "And what of loyalty?" he asked, his voice still calm, but with a sharper edge. "Loyalty to your family? To your blood? Is loyalty only about obedience?" Francesca asked, her voice trembling, but resolute. "Is it only about following orders, about suppressing your own desires, your own heart?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Salvatore studied her, his gaze intense and unwavering. He saw the change in her, the spark of rebellion that had been ignited. He saw the woman she was becoming, a woman who was no longer willing to be a pawn in a game she didn't choose to play. He glanced at Marco, who stood silently, his expression a mixture of concern and understanding. Marco had always been more pragmatic, more willing to bend the rules, to find a compromise. Perhaps, Salvatore said slowly, his voice thoughtful, there is another way. A way to navigate this situation. A way that does not require you to completely abandon your feelings. Francesca's heart leaped with a flicker of hope. It was a small concession, a tiny crack in the wall of tradition, but it was enough. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Salvatore leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. The De Lucas, he said, his voice low and calculating, have made their move. They are pushing for more territory, more power. They are testing us, probing for weaknesses. He paused, his gaze shifting to Marco. We need to respond. We need to show them that we are not to be trifled with. But we also need to be strategic. We need to find a way to contain the situation. To prevent all-out war. He looked back at Francesca, his eyes holding a glimmer of something she couldn't quite decipher. And perhaps, he said, his voice almost a whisper, you, Francesca, can be part of that strategy. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Francesca felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She didn't know what Salvatore had in mind, but she knew it would be dangerous. It would involve walking a tightrope between two warring families, between her loyalty to her blood and her love for a forbidden man. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. There is a gathering, Salvatore said, his voice deliberately vague. A meeting of the families. A chance to discuss the situation. To negotiate. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. It will be held tomorrow night. At the Villa Medici. A neutral ground. A place where words, not weapons, will be the currency. He continued after another dramatic pause, his words sending a chill mixed with a feverish anticipation through her veins. I want you to be there, Francesca. With me and Marco, and with Lorenzo present. We will see what kind of man he truly is, where his true loyalties lied, and you, my dear, will help us find out, under the pretense of civility. It's a dance, Francesca, a dance beneath a treacherous moon. She felt that this was only the start, that she had been plunged deeper, and that her every action, every word, from then on would hold the weight of a war. Chapter 5. Echoes of Promises in the Dark. The Villa Medici, a sprawling Renaissance masterpiece nestled amidst lush gardens and overlooking the shimmering expanse of the Tyrrhenian Sea, was a place of both breathtaking beauty and underlying tension. It was a neutral ground, a haven where the warring families of Naples often met to negotiate truces, forge alliances, and, sometimes, bury their dead. Tonight, it felt more like a stage set for a tragedy, the air thick with unspoken threats and veiled intentions. Francesca stood on the vast terrace, the cool night air doing little to soothe the feverish heat of her anxiety. She wore a dress of deep midnight blue, the color of a stormy sea, its simple elegance a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns favored by the other women present. She had chosen it deliberately, a subtle act of defiance, a refusal to be adorned like a prize to be won or lost. The gathering was a carefully orchestrated dance of power and pretense. The men, representatives of the various Camorra families, stood in small clusters, their voices low and guarded, their eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing threats and opportunities. The women, their wives and daughters, were present as well, their role a carefully choreographed display of wealth, beauty, and, above all, loyalty. Francesca had been briefed by Salvatore. Her role was to observe, to listen, to be a presence that both attracted and deflected attention. To be a subtle weapon in a game of shadows. He had not explicitly instructed her to engage with Lorenzo, but the unspoken understanding was clear. She was to gauge his intentions, to test his loyalty, to see if he was a genuine threat or a potential asset. She had not seen Lorenzo since the night on the cobblestone street, since the moment Marco had interrupted their forbidden encounter. The memory of his touch, his voice, the intensity of his gaze, was a constant, throbbing presence in her mind, a dangerous melody that played beneath the surface of her carefully constructed composure. She spotted him across the terrace, standing with his father, Don Alessandro De Luca, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary. Lorenzo looked different. More guarded, more controlled, the raw intensity she had glimpsed in him carefully masked. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit that accentuated his lean, powerful physique. He looked every inch the Camorra prince, a man born to rule, to command, to conquer. Their eyes met across the crowded terrace. A flicker of recognition, of something deeper, passed between them. A silent acknowledgement of the forbidden connection that bound them together, a connection that defied the boundaries of their warring families. It was a brief, fleeting moment, but it was enough to send a jolt of awareness through her, a reminder of the stakes involved. As the evening progressed, Francesca found herself drawn into conversations with various members of the other families. She spoke with veiled courtesy, her words carefully chosen, her smiles polite but guarded. She listened to the subtle jabs, the veiled threats, the intricate dance of power that played out beneath the surface of polite conversation. She noticed the way Lorenzo watched her, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands, the curve of her neck. He didn't approach her, didn't speak to her directly, but his presence was a constant, palpable force in the room. It was as if he were marking her, claiming her, even in the midst of their enemies. At one point, she found herself standing near a group of men, including Don Alessandro De Luca. He was a formidable figure, his face etched with the lines of a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous waters of the Camorra. His eyes, cold and calculating, assessed her with a chilling detachment. "Francesca Barone," he said, his voice a low growl. "You are even more beautiful than the rumors suggest." It was not a compliment, but a statement of fact, an assessment of her value as a potential prize. She met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "Thank you, Don Alessandro," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But I am not here to be admired. I am here to listen." A flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect, crossed his face. He had expected fear, submission, perhaps even a flirtatious response. He had not expected this quiet defiance. "Indeed," he said, his voice softening slightly. "And what have you heard, Francesca Barone?" "I have heard whispers of war," she said, her voice low and steady. "Whispers of bloodshed and betrayal. Whispers that threaten to engulf us all." Her words hung in the air, a challenge, a warning. She saw Lorenzo, standing behind his father, his expression unreadable. Don Alessandro smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "War is sometimes necessary," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "To maintain order. To protect what is ours." "And what is yours, Don Alessandro?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Territory? Power? Respect? Or something more?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Don Alessandro studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and unwavering. Then he turned away, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. As the evening drew to a close, Francesca found herself alone on a secluded part of the terrace, overlooking the moonlit sea. The air was cool and fragrant, the sound of the waves a soothing counterpoint to the tension that had been building within her all evening. She felt a presence behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Lorenzo. He stood close, but not touching, his presence a silent force field around her. "You played your part well," he said, his voice low and resonant, echoing the promises hidden in the dark recesses of her memory, of their shared past. She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. The moonlight illuminated his face, casting shadows that accentuated the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the intensity of his gaze. "It was just a game, Lorenzo," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A performance. Was it?" he countered, his eyes challenging her. "Or was there something more?" She didn't answer, couldn't answer. The truth was too dangerous, too volatile. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek. The contact was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. "You cannot deny what is between us, Francesca," he said, his voice a husky whisper. "Not anymore." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a brief, fleeting kiss, a taste of the forbidden, a promise of things to come. A promise that was almost immediately broken, before she could stop him, before she could decide. The kiss ended, and a voice, cold, sharp, and steeped in fury, sliced the night apart. "Lorenzo, what is the meaning of this?" Chapter 6. The Scent of Gunpowder and Roses. The voice, laced with barely suppressed rage, belonged to Don Alessandro. He stood at the entrance to the terrace, his figure silhouetted against the light streaming from the villa, his eyes blazing with fury. Beside him stood Marco, his face a mask of grim disapproval, his hand resting conspicuously on the hilt of a knife concealed beneath his jacket. Lorenzo stepped back from Francesca, his expression instantly hardening, the mask of the Camorra prince firmly back in place. He showed no fear, no remorse, only a cold defiance that mirrored his father's anger. "Father," he said, his voice calm and controlled, but with an underlying steeliness that was unmistakable. "I was merely exchanging pleasantries with Signorina Barone." Don Alessandro's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting from Lorenzo to Francesca, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Pleasantries?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call it, Lorenzo? Fraternizing with the enemy?" Francesca felt a wave of fear wash over her, but she stood her ground, refusing to cower before the Don's wrath. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and something else. A spark of the forbidden desire that still flickered between her and Lorenzo, a desire that no amount of threats or intimidation could extinguish. "We were discussing the situation, Don Alessandro," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "Trying to find common ground." Don Alessandro snorted, a sound of derision. "Common ground?" he repeated. "There is no common ground with the Barone. Only blood and betrayal." He turned his attention back to Lorenzo, his voice hardening. "You are a De Luca," he said, his words like a whip. "You have a duty, a responsibility. You will not dishonor your family by consorting with this woman." The insult, delivered with such venom, stung Francesca, but she refused to show it. She had expected this, had known the risks involved. She had chosen to walk this dangerous path, and she would not back down now. Lorenzo's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. "I am not dishonoring my family," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I am exploring possibilities." "Possibilities?" Don Alessandro roared. "There are no possibilities with the Barone. Only war." The tension on the terrace was palpable, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and roses, a volatile combination that threatened to explode at any moment. Marco stepped forward, his hand still resting on his knife. "Lorenzo," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's time to leave." It was not a suggestion, but a command. A warning. Lorenzo knew that Marco was not afraid to use force, to defend his sister's honor, to protect his family's interests. Lorenzo held his father's gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded, a slight inclination of his head that was both a concession and a challenge. He turned to Francesca, his eyes lingering on hers for a brief, fleeting moment. A silent message passed between them, a message of defiance, of longing, of a forbidden love that refused to be extinguished. "Until next time, Francesca," he said, his voice low and resonant, a promise and a threat. Then, he turned and walked away, following his father back into the villa, leaving Francesca standing alone on the terrace, the echo of his words, the scent of his presence, lingering in the air. Marco approached her, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, Francesca?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. She nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible.
"I'm fine."
But she wasn't fine.
She was far from fine.
The encounter with Lorenzo, the confrontation with his father, had shaken her to her core. It had brought the reality of their situation into sharp focus, the danger, the impossibility, the sheer recklessness of their forbidden love. Marco put his arm around her, a gesture of comfort and support. "Come on," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's go home." As they walked back into the villa, Francesca felt a profound sense of unease. The evening had been a carefully orchestrated performance, a dance of power and pretense. But beneath the surface, the currents of conflict were swirling, threatening to erupt into a full-blown war. She knew that the kiss on the terrace, the brief, stolen moment of connection with Lorenzo, had changed everything. It had sealed their fate, had drawn them both deeper into a dangerous game that neither of them might survive. She looked back at where Lorenzo had been and saw the empty space as a chasm, growing between them, threatening to swallow them whole. Chapter 7. Unveiling the Serpent's Gaze. The days following the gathering at the Villa Medici were a tense, uneasy calm before an inevitable storm. Francesca found herself trapped in a web of conflicting emotions, torn between her loyalty to her family and her undeniable attraction to Lorenzo. The memory of his kiss, the brief, fleeting moment of connection they had shared, haunted her waking thoughts and invaded her dreams. Salvatore had been unusually quiet since their return from the villa, his silence more unsettling than any reprimand. He spent hours in his study, poring over documents, making phone calls, engaging in hushed conversations with Marco. Francesca knew he was planning, strategizing, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the De Lucas. She, on the other hand, felt increasingly isolated, shut out from the inner circle of decision-making, relegated to the role of observer, a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. She tried to focus on her daily routine, the familiar tasks that had once provided a sense of normalcy, a refuge from the turmoil of her inner world. She tended to the gardens, overseeing the meticulous care of the roses, their vibrant blooms a stark contrast to the darkness that was gathering around her. She visited the local church, seeking solace in the quiet serenity of the ancient sanctuary, praying for guidance, for strength, for a way out of the impossible situation she found herself in. But even in these moments of quiet contemplation, Lorenzo's presence was a constant, nagging undercurrent. She found herself replaying their encounters in her mind, analyzing his words, his gestures, trying to decipher his true intentions. Was he genuinely drawn to her, or was he merely using her, manipulating her for his own gain? The question tormented her, a serpent's whisper that poisoned her thoughts. One afternoon, while she was arranging flowers in the grand foyer, a visitor arrived. It was not one of the usual associates of Salvatore or Marco, the men who came and went with hushed urgency, their faces grim and determined. It was a woman Francesca had never seen before. She was tall and strikingly beautiful, with fiery red hair that cascaded down her back like a molten waterfall. Her eyes, a vibrant emerald green, were sharp and assessing, taking in Francesca's appearance with a cool detachment. She wore a dress of exquisite design, its rich fabric and intricate details a clear indication of wealth and status. "Signorina Barone?" she asked, her voice smooth and melodious, but with an underlying steeliness that sent a shiver down Francesca's spine. Francesca nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
Who are you?
The woman smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that did not reach her eyes. "My name is Isabella Rossi," she said, "and I have a message for you from Lorenzo De Luca." Francesca felt a jolt of surprise, mingled with a surge of apprehension. Lorenzo had sent a messenger? A woman? What did it mean? Isabella held out a small, sealed envelope, its surface embossed with the De Luca family crest, a coiled serpent, its fangs bared. The symbol, a stark reminder of the danger that Lorenzo represented, sent a chill down Francesca's spine. The serpent seemed to stare straight at her, its gaze knowing and dangerous. It was as if the woman across her, with her green eyes, was also a serpent. Francesca hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the envelope. She knew that accepting it, opening it, Reading its contents would be another step down a dangerous path, a path that could lead to her destruction. But she couldn't resist. The pull was too strong, the allure of the forbidden too intoxicating. She had to know what Lorenzo wanted, what he was planning. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. Isabella nodded, her green eyes fixed on Francesca's face, her expression unreadable. "He said you would understand," she said, her voice a cryptic whisper. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor, leaving Francesca standing alone in the grand foyer, the sealed envelope clutched in her hand, the serpent's gaze burning into her soul. She felt, at that moment, a sense of foreboding, of impending doom. The serpent, it seemed, had finally revealed its true intentions. Chapter 8. A Cage of Gilded Loyalties. Francesca retreated to the sanctuary of her private sitting room, a small, elegantly appointed space overlooking the villa's meticulously manicured gardens. The room, with its soft pastel colors, delicate antique furniture, and shelves filled with well-loved books, had always been her refuge, a place where she could escape the pressures and expectations of her family, of her world. But today, the room offered little solace. The sealed envelope, with its ominous serpent crest, lay on the small writing desk, a tangible representation of the dangerous game she was entangled in. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of thick, creamy paper. The handwriting was bold and decisive, unmistakably Lorenzo's. The words were few, cryptic, but their meaning was clear. "Meet me. Tonight. Midnight. The old observatory. You know the way." No signature, no salutation, just the stark command, a summons that she could not ignore. Francesca read the message again and again, her mind racing. The old observatory. It was a secluded, abandoned structure located on the far edge of the Barone estate, a relic from a bygone era when her ancestors had dabbled in astronomy. She had not been there in years, but she remembered the way, the winding path through the overgrown gardens, the crumbling stone steps leading to the heavy oak door. It was a dangerous place, a place of shadows and secrets. A place where she could be alone with Lorenzo, away from the prying eyes of their families, away from the constraints of their warring worlds. But it was also a trap. She knew that. She knew that meeting Lorenzo, alone, in the dead of night, was reckless, foolish, a violation of every rule, every precaution. It was a betrayal of her family, of her loyalty, of everything she had been taught to believe in. And yet, she couldn't resist. The pull was too strong. The desire to see him, to hear his voice, to feel his touch, was overwhelming. She had made her choice, had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. She spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened anxiety, her mind replaying every possible scenario, every potential consequence. She tried to distract herself, to focus on mundane tasks, but Lorenzo's message was a constant, throbbing presence in her thoughts, a dangerous undercurrent that pulled her towards the inevitable. As dusk settled over the villa, casting long shadows across the gardens, Francesca began to prepare. She chose a simple, dark dress, practical and unadorned, a stark contrast to the elegant gown she had worn at the Villa Medici. She needed to be able to move freely, to escape if necessary. She waited until the house was quiet, until the servants had retired for the night, until Salvatore and Marco were engrossed in their usual late-night discussions in the study. Then, she slipped out of her room, a shadow moving through the darkened corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. The night air was cool and damp, the scent of jasmine and night blooming cereus heavy in the air. The moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, casting the gardens in an eerie, ethereal glow. She followed the winding path, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth, her senses on high alert. The old observatory loomed before her, a dark, imposing silhouette against the night sky. Its stone walls were crumbling, its windows shattered, its heavy oak door hanging precariously on its hinges. It was a place of forgotten dreams, of lost hopes, a fitting setting for this clandestine meeting, this forbidden rendezvous. She hesitated at the entrance, her hand trembling as she reached for the rusty iron latch. She knew that stepping inside, crossing that threshold, would change everything. It would be a point of no return. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door, the sound of its creaking hinges echoing in the silence. She stepped inside, into the darkness, into the unknown, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the shattered windows and the beating of her own treacherous heart. The room was empty, a cage built by her loyalties, and one she knew she should not have stepped into willingly. But she had, and now, there would be no simple way out. She could only wait. Chapter 9. The Taste of Betrayal's Wine. The observatory was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Moonlight streamed through the shattered dome, illuminating the remnants of a bygone era, a massive, rusted telescope, crumbling star charts, and scattered astronomical instruments. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the frantic beating of Francesca's heart. She waited, her senses on high alert, her body tense with anticipation and fear. Every creak of the old building, every whisper of the wind, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She had walked into a trap. She knew it, but there was no turning back. Then she heard it. A soft footstep, the rustle of fabric, the faint scent of his familiar cologne, a mixture of sandalwood and something darker, more primal. He was there. Lorenzo stepped out of the shadows, his figure a dark silhouette against the moonlit windows. He moved with a silent grace, a predator in his natural habitat. He didn't speak, just looked at her, his eyes, dark and unreadable, scanning her face, her body, assessing her. "You came," he said finally, his voice a low murmur, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of her surrender. "You knew I would," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. He smiled, a slow, sardonic smile that did not reach his eyes. "I did," he said. "You are predictable, Francesca, just like your family." The word stung, a deliberate provocation, a reminder of the chasm that separated them. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and hurt. "And you, Lorenzo?" she countered. "Are you so different? Are you not also bound by the rules, the expectations, the cage of your family?" His smile vanished, his expression hardening. "I make my own rules," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "I am not bound by anything or anyone." It was a lie, she knew it. He was as trapped as she was, a prisoner of his family's legacy, of the ancient feud that had defined their lives for generations. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his body heat radiating towards her. She could feel the pull, the dangerous allure that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Why did you ask me to come here, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. The contact was electric, sending a surge of heat through her. "I wanted to see you," he said, his voice softening, his eyes searching hers. Away from the prying eyes, the whispers, the lies. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a question, a plea. She hesitated for a moment, her mind screaming at her to resist, to push him away, to escape. But she couldn't. The desire was too strong, the need too overwhelming. She closed her eyes and surrendered, her lips parting under his, her body melting against his. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. It was a kiss of desperation, of longing, of a forbidden love that defied all reason, all logic. It was a kiss that tasted of betrayal, of danger, of a future that might never be. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if afraid to let her go. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and ecstasy. Then, suddenly, he pulled away, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of regret and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice rough with emotion. We can't do this." His words were a blow, a cold splash of reality that shattered the illusion, the fantasy. She stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling. "Why, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice choked with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this? Why are you playing these games?" He turned away, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his gesture one of frustration, of despair. "It's complicated," he said, his voice barely audible. "Complicated?" she repeated, her voice rising in anger and disbelief. "Is that all you can say? After everything? After the kiss, the promises, the lies?" He turned back to face her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "There are things you don't understand, Francesca," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Things you can't possibly know. Then tell me," she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Tell me the truth, Lorenzo. For once, just tell me the truth." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if struggling with some inner turmoil. Then suddenly a noise. A faint rustle from outside, a twig snapping, a shadow moving in the darkness. Lorenzo's eyes widened, his expression instantly hardening. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and urgent. "We have to go," he said, his voice a harsh whisper.
Now.
He pulled her towards the door, his movements swift and decisive. She stumbled after him, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. They were not alone. Someone had followed them. Someone had heard their conversation. Someone had witnessed their forbidden kiss. And that someone had poured the wine of treachery, its bitter taste now on her lips. Chapter 10. Whispers in the Catacombs. Lorenzo dragged Francesca through the overgrown gardens, his pace relentless, his grip on her arm unyielding. The moon, now free from the clouds, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock their desperate flight. The scent of night-blooming jasmine, once a source of comfort, now felt cloying, suffocating, a reminder of the beauty that had been shattered. They reached a small, hidden door concealed behind a thick wall of ivy. It was an entrance to the catacombs, a network of underground tunnels that ran beneath the Barone estate, a relic from a time when the villa had served as a monastery. Francesca had explored them as a child, fascinated by their dark, mysterious depths, but she had not been down there in years. Lorenzo pushed open the heavy, wooden door, the sound of its creaking hinges echoing in the night. He pulled her inside, into the darkness, into the cold, damp embrace of the earth. The air in the catacombs was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, a stark contrast to the fragrant gardens above. The only light came from the sliver of moon visible through the doorway, casting an eerie, ethereal glow on the rough-hewn stone walls. Lorenzo closed the door behind them, plunging them into complete darkness. He released her arm, his hand reaching for hers, his fingers interlacing with hers, a silent reassurance in the oppressive gloom. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of their breathing.
And be quiet.
He led her through the labyrinthine tunnels, his steps sure and confident, even in the darkness. He seemed to know the way, as if he had been here before many times. Francesca stumbled along beside him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. Who had followed them? Was it Marco?
Salvatore?
Or someone from the De Luca family? Had they been betrayed? By whom? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, a tormenting chorus of doubt and fear. She trusted Lorenzo. She wanted to trust him, but the events of the past few weeks had shaken her faith, had eroded the foundations of her world. They reached a larger chamber, a central hub from which several tunnels branched off. Lorenzo stopped, his hand tightening on hers. He listened intently, his body tense, alert. "We're safe here," he said, his voice a low murmur.
For now.
He leaned against the wall, his figure a dark silhouette in the faint light filtering from a small, grated opening high above. He seemed exhausted, defeated, the mask of the Camorra prince stripped away, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. Francesca sat down on a cold, stone bench, her legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes searching his face, trying to decipher the truth, to understand the secrets he held. "Who was it, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who followed us?" He hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. "I don't know," he said, his voice evasive. She didn't believe him. She knew he was lying, protecting someone or something. "Don't lie to me, Lorenzo," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt.
Not now.
"Not after everything." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his gesture one of frustration, of despair. "It was someone from my family," he admitted, his voice low and heavy. The words were a blow, a confirmation of her worst fears. Betrayal. From within his own family.
But why?
"And who?" "Who?" she asked, her voice choked with unshed tears. "Was it your father?" He shook his head.
"No," he said.
"It wasn't him." "Then who?" She persisted, her voice rising in desperation. "Tell me, Lorenzo. I need to know." He hesitated again, his gaze locking with hers. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if struggling with some inner turmoil. It became clear to her he knew precisely who it was. "It was Isabella," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. The name, like a viper, slithered through the silence. The red-haired woman. The messenger. The serpent. Francesca felt a chill run down her spine. Isabella. The woman who had delivered Lorenzo's message, the woman with the emerald green eyes, the woman who had looked at her with such cool detachment, such knowing.
"But why?" she
asked, her voice trembling. Why would she do this? Lorenzo looked away, his expression clouded with pain and shame. She has her own agenda," he said, his voice evasive. "She wants me for herself." The words, spoken with such reluctance, such bitterness, revealed a truth that Francesca had suspected, but had never dared to acknowledge. Isabella was in love with Lorenzo, and she was jealous. Jealous of Francesca, of the connection she shared with him, of the forbidden love that threatened to consume them both. "She wants to destroy us," Francesca whispered, her voice filled with a chilling realization. The situation's complexities were a tightening noose, and she didn't know if she would survive. Lorenzo nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. A new resolve hardened his features, the haunted look replaced by a familiar steeliness. "She won't succeed," he said, his voice low and fierce, the echoes of his promise resounding through the ancient catacombs, a vow spoken in the darkness, a promise that would either save them or doom them both. Chapter 11. The Price of a Stolen Moment. The revelation of Isabella's betrayal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the damp, musty air of the catacombs. Francesca felt a wave of despair wash over her, a sense of being trapped in a web of deceit and danger, with no escape in sight. Lorenzo's words, "She won't succeed," echoed in her mind, a fragile promise that offered little comfort. She knew the power of a woman scorned, the lengths to which jealousy and ambition could drive a person. Isabella was a formidable adversary, a woman who wielded influence and power within the De Luca family, a woman who would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. "What are we going to do, Lorenzo?" Francesca asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his face for answers, for reassurance. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of determination and tenderness. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his touch sending a familiar shiver down her spine. "We're going to fight," he said, his voice low and firm. "We're going to fight for what we want, for what we deserve." His words, spoken with such conviction, ignited a spark of hope within her, a flicker of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. She had always been a fighter, a survivor, but she had never faced a challenge like this before. "But how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Our families, they'll never allow it." Isabella, she'll use this against us. Lorenzo's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. I don't care about our families, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. I don't care about their ancient feuds, their petty squabbles. I care about you, Francesca. Only you. His words, spoken with such raw emotion, took her breath away. It was the first time he had openly declared his feelings for her, the first time he had admitted the depth of his commitment. It was a declaration of love, a promise of loyalty, a defiance of everything that stood between them. She reached out, her hand touching his, her fingers interlacing with his. And I care about you, Lorenzo, she said, her voice choked with emotion. More than you know. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tender kiss, a moment of solace in the midst of chaos, a reaffirmation of their connection, of their forbidden love. But the moment was fleeting. The reality of their situation, the danger that surrounded them, was inescapable. We need a plan, Lorenzo said, his voice regaining its urgency. We need to get out of here and we need to disappear. For a while, at least. Disappear. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. It meant leaving everything behind, their families, their homes, their lives. It meant starting over, creating a new identity, a new existence, a new world where they could be together, free from the constraints of their past. Where would we go? Francesca asked, her voice barely a whisper. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Lorenzo smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile that flickered across his lips. I have a place, he said. A safe place. Somewhere no one will find us. He didn't elaborate, didn't reveal any details, but she trusted him. She had to trust him. He was her only hope, her only ally in this dangerous game. They left the catacombs under the cover of darkness, emerging into the cool night air, their senses on high alert. They moved quickly and silently, shadows flitting through the overgrown gardens, their destination unknown, their future uncertain. As they reached the edge of the estate, Lorenzo stopped, his hand tightening on hers. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. Are you sure about this, Francesca? He asked, his voice low and urgent. Are you sure you want to do this? You'll be giving up everything for me. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a newfound determination. She had made her choice. She had chosen love over loyalty, freedom over obligation, a future with Lorenzo over a life lived in the shadows. I'm sure, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. I'm more sure of this than anything I've ever done in my life. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that illuminated his face with a warmth that melted away the years, the pain, the darkness. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that tasted of freedom, of hope, of a future that was finally within their reach. The price, they both knew, was steep. They would pay it, together. Chapter 12. Scars that bind and break. The safe place Lorenzo had spoken of turned out to be a small, secluded villa perched on a cliff overlooking the Amalfi coast. It was a world away from the opulent grandeur of the Barone estate, a simple, rustic dwelling surrounded by lemon groves and olive trees, the air thick with the scent of salt and sea. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a haven of peace and tranquility, a refuge from the storm that had engulfed their lives. The villa itself was modest, with whitewashed walls, terracotta floors, and simple, handcrafted furniture. It felt real, authentic, a stark contrast to the gilded cages they had left behind. For the first few days, Francesca and Lorenzo lived in a state of blissful isolation, their world reduced to the confines of the villa, their days filled with a simple routine of shared meals, long walks along the rugged coastline, and quiet evenings spent talking, laughing, and rediscovering each other. They spoke of their pasts, their families, their dreams, their fears. They shared stories they had never told anyone before, revealing the hidden depths of their souls, the scars that bound them together and, sometimes, threatened to break them apart. Francesca learned of Lorenzo's childhood, of the pressures and expectations he had faced as the heir to the DeLuca Empire, of the ruthless training he had endured, of the violence he had witnessed and, sometimes, participated in. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret that haunted him, the yearning for a different life, a life free from the constraints of his family's legacy. Lorenzo, in turn, learned of Francesca's quiet desperation, of the loveless marriage she had endured, of the stifled dreams, the suppressed desires, the yearning for a love that had always seemed out of reach. He saw the strength in her, the resilience, the unwavering spirit that had refused to be broken, despite the gilded cage she had been confined to. They made love, slowly, tenderly, passionately, their bodies rediscovering each other, their souls merging in a union that defied the boundaries of their warring worlds. It was a love born of desperation, of longing, of a forbidden connection that had blossomed in the darkness, a love that was both a refuge and a risk. But even in this idyllic setting, the shadows of their past lingered. The fear of discovery, the threat of betrayal, was a constant, nagging undercurrent. They knew they couldn't hide forever, that their families would be searching for them, that Isabella would be plotting her revenge. One evening, as they sat on the small terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Lorenzo broke the silence. "We need to talk about the future," he said, his voice hesitant, his eyes searching hers. Francesca nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of apprehension and hope. She knew this conversation was inevitable, that they couldn't live in this bubble of blissful isolation forever. "What are we going to do, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't stay here forever." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking, making plans." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. "I have contacts," he said. "People who can help us. People who can erase us. Give us new identities, new lives far away from here." The words were both a promise and a threat. A promise of a future together, a future free from the constraints of their past. A threat of losing everything they had ever known, of becoming strangers in a strange land. Francesca looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. The thought of starting over, of shedding their past like a snake sheds its skin, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Where would we go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile that flickered across his lips.
"Somewhere different," he said.
"Somewhere safe. Somewhere we can be ourselves." He didn't reveal any details, didn't name a specific place, but she trusted him. She had to trust him. He was her only hope, her only ally in this dangerous game. But there was also a scar that hadn't healed. The scar of Isabella. "And what about Isabella?" she asked, the question she had been trying to ignore making a brutal appearance. Lorenzo frowned, the scar of that question mirroring her own. "She will be dealt with," he said with a cold and final tone. That scared her. Scared her, because that was the voice, the look, of the man he had tried to leave behind. And now it resurfaced. And she knew she would have to face those scars from the past and the present, from her lover and from herself. Because a new life wouldn't mean a clean slate. Chapter 13. The gathering storm of secrets. The fragile peace of their secluded haven began to unravel, the idyllic calm shattered by the looming threat of their past catching up to them. Lorenzo became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, his face grim and determined. He was making arrangements, pulling strings, calling in favors, preparing for their escape, their transformation. Francesca tried to remain optimistic, to focus on the promise of a future together, a future free from the constraints of their families, their warring worlds. But the fear was always there, a constant, nagging undercurrent that eroded her hope, her faith. She knew that Lorenzo was keeping secrets from her, shielding her from the harsh realities of their situation. She understood his intentions, his desire to protect her, but the secrecy also created a distance between them, a subtle barrier that threatened to undermine their fragile bond. One afternoon, while Lorenzo was out, making one of his mysterious calls, Francesca decided to explore the villa more thoroughly. She had been content, until now, to remain within the confines of their small, shared world, but a restless energy had taken hold of her, a need to understand, to uncover the truth. She wandered through the rooms, her fingers tracing the surfaces of the simple, handcrafted furniture, her eyes scanning the bookshelves, the artwork, searching for clues, for answers. In a small, dusty study, tucked away at the back of the villa, she found a locked drawer in an old wooden desk. She hesitated, her conscience pricking her, but the urge to know, to understand, was too strong to resist. She found a hairpin and, with a skill she hadn't known she possessed, managed to pick the lock. Inside the drawer, she found a collection of documents, letters, photographs, all neatly organized, all bearing the DeLuca family crest, the coiled serpent, its fangs bared. Her heart pounded in her chest as she began to sift through the contents. She found financial records, details of business transactions, evidence of Lorenzo's involvement in the Camorra, in the dark, illegal activities that had sustained his family's power for generations. She found letters, correspondence between Lorenzo and various individuals, some of whom she recognized as prominent figures in the Neapolitan underworld. The letters spoke of alliances, of rivalries, of betrayals, of violence. And then, she found it, a photograph. A picture of Lorenzo, younger, his arm around Isabella, their faces close, their smiles intimate. It was a picture of lovers, of a past that Lorenzo had tried to erase, a past that still haunted him, that still threatened to destroy them. Francesca felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She had known, of course, about Isabella's feelings for Lorenzo, about her jealousy, her desire for revenge. But seeing this photograph, this tangible evidence of their past intimacy, brought the reality of the situation crashing down on her. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that Lorenzo had not been entirely honest with her, that he had downplayed the depth of his relationship with Isabella, that he had kept secrets, dangerous secrets, that could have devastating consequences. She heard a noise and quickly hid all the papers. Lorenzo entered. He was pale. He was scared. And for the first time, Francesca felt that maybe he wasn't as in control as he pretended to be. "They know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know we are here. And they're coming." The storm, it seemed, had finally broken. Chapter 14. A Requiem for Lost Innocence. Lorenzo's words, stark and chilling, hung in the air, a death knell for their fragile peace. The idyllic refuge, the secluded villa that had promised sanctuary, had become a trap. The storm, long gathering on the horizon, had finally broken, unleashing its fury upon them.
How?
Francesca asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching Lorenzo's face for answers, for reassurance, for a glimmer of hope in the face of impending doom. He didn't answer, couldn't answer. He didn't know how they had been discovered, who had betrayed them. Was it Isabella?
Marco? Salvatore?
Or someone else, someone they hadn't even considered? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, a tormenting chorus of doubt and fear. She had trusted Lorenzo, had placed her life, her future, in his hands. But now, that trust was shaken, eroded by the secrets he had kept, by the lies he had told, by the dangerous game he had been playing. "We have to leave," Lorenzo said, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning the room, assessing their options, calculating their escape.
"Now.
Before they get here." He grabbed a bag, a small, nondescript satchel that he had kept hidden in a closet. He began to pack, hastily throwing in a few clothes, some money, and she noticed a gun. The sight of the weapon, a stark reminder of the violent world they inhabited, sent a chill down her spine. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that they could escape that world, that they could leave the violence, the bloodshed, behind. But now she realized it was inescapable. It was a part of them, a part of their past, a part of their future. Francesca stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, by indecision. She looked around the small villa, at the simple, rustic furniture, at the sun-drenched terrace, at the breathtaking view of the Amalfi Coast. It had been their sanctuary, their haven, their brief taste of paradise. And now, it was about to be lost, destroyed by the forces that had been pursuing them, by the secrets that had been festering beneath the surface. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice barely a whisper, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can run. I don't know if I can live like this." He stopped packing, his hands stilling, his gaze locking with hers. He saw the fear in her eyes, the doubt, the despair. He saw the woman she had been, the innocent, sheltered woman who had dared to dream of a different life, a life with him. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. He reached out, his hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that were streaming down her cheeks. "I know," he said, his voice soft, tender, filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "I know it's not easy. I know it's not what you wanted. But we have no choice, Francesca. We have to fight. We have to survive." He leaned in and kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that tasted of desperation, of longing, of a love that was being tested, perhaps to its breaking point. It was a kiss that was both a farewell and a promise, a requiem for their lost innocence, a prelude to the battle that lay ahead. He pulled away, his eyes searching hers. "Trust me," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "Please, Francesca."
Trust me.
She looked at him, at the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had shown her a different world, a different life. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the determination. She saw the scars that bound them together, the scars that threatened to break them apart. She nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. She had made her choice. She had chosen him, and she would follow him, even into the darkness, even into the storm. She would fight, even if it meant losing everything, even herself, because now all she had was him. Chapter 15. The Thorns of a Hidden Truth. They fled the villa under the cover of darkness, leaving behind their brief sanctuary, their shattered dreams. Lorenzo drove a small, nondescript car he had stashed in a nearby village, navigating the winding coastal roads with a reckless speed, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of pursuit. Francesca sat beside him, her body tense, her senses on high alert. The fear was a constant, throbbing presence, a cold knot in her stomach that refused to loosen its grip. She clutched the small bag containing their meager belongings, her knuckles white, her mind racing. Where were they going? What was Lorenzo's plan? How would they escape the relentless pursuit of their families, of Isabella, of the forces that sought to destroy them? She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but she remained silent, her trust in Lorenzo, though shaken, still her only anchor in this swirling storm of uncertainty. As they drove, the landscape blurred past them, a tapestry of moonlit hills, dark forests, and the shimmering expanse of the sea. The beauty of the Amalfi Coast, once a source of solace, now seemed to mock them, a reminder of the paradise they had lost. Suddenly, Lorenzo swerved the car sharply, pulling off the main road and onto a narrow, dirt track that wound its way up into the hills. Francesca gasped, her body thrown against the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "Shortcut," he said, his voice terse, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We need to lose them." Lose them? Who? Had they been spotted? Was someone following them? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, a tormenting chorus of doubt and fear. She gripped the dashboard, her body bracing for impact, as the car bounced and swayed along the rough, uneven track. They drove for what seemed like an eternity, the silence broken only by the roar of the engine, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires, and the frantic beating of Francesca's heart. Finally, Lorenzo slowed the car, pulling into a small, secluded clearing hidden amidst a thick grove of olive trees. He switched off the engine, plunging them into darkness, into silence. "We're safe here," he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath coming in ragged gasps.
For now.
He leaned back in his seat, his shoulders slumping, his body exhausted. He looked at Francesca, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I got you into this, Francesca. I never wanted." His words trailed off, unfinished, the weight of his unspoken regrets hanging heavy in the air. Francesca reached out, her hand touching his, her fingers interlacing with his. "It's not your fault, Lorenzo," she said, her voice soft, tender. "We made this choice together." He squeezed her hand, his grip tight, almost painful. "But I lied to you, Francesca," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "There are things I didn't tell you." The words, spoken with such reluctance, such shame, sent a chill down her spine. She had known, of course, that Lorenzo was keeping secrets from her, that he was shielding her from the harsh realities of their situation. But hearing him admit it, hearing the pain in his voice, was a blow, a confirmation of her deepest fears. "I found the photograph," she confessed, her voice ashamedly low. "The one with Isabella." Lorenzo went silent. He looked away. "There's more, isn't it?" Francesca asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes still averted. "The villa, it wasn't just a safe house, was it?" She continued, piecing together the fragmented truths, the hidden thorns that had been pricking her all along. "It was hers. Isabella's." Lorenzo finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. He nodded again. "Yes," he admitted, his voice a raw whisper. "It was a gift. From her father. Years ago." The truth, like a poisoned dart, pierced Francesca's heart. The villa, their sanctuary, their brief paradise, had been a gilded cage, a symbol of Lorenzo's past, of his entanglement with Isabella, of the web of deceit and betrayal that had ensnared them both. And now it was clear. Isabella hadn't just stumbled upon their location. She had led them there. She had known all along. The realization was a punch, winding her, forcing her to take in the cruel, awful truth that Lorenzo's omission of the truth had been a form of protection, but also a way to let Isabella play her twisted games. Chapter 16. Fire and blood on the horizon. The weight of Lorenzo's confession, the realization that their sanctuary had been a carefully orchestrated trap, hung heavy in the air, suffocating Francesca with a sense of betrayal and despair. She felt a wave of anger, of hurt, of a profound sense of violation. "Why, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his face for answers, for an explanation that could somehow mitigate the pain, the disillusionment. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let her use us like that?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the car window, his expression clouded with shame, with regret, with a pain that mirrored her own. "I thought I could control her," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his words a confession of his own hubris, his own miscalculation. "I thought I could manage the situation. I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want you to know."
Know what?
She demanded, her voice rising in anger, in frustration. "Know that you were still entangled with her? Know that our refuge was a lie? Know that we were walking into a trap?" He flinched, his body recoiling as if struck by her words. He reached out, his hand trembling, as if to touch her, to comfort her, but then he stopped short, his hand falling back to his side. "It wasn't like that, Francesca," he said, his voice pleading, desperate. I haven't been with Isabella, not since I met you."
"I swear."
His words, spoken with such conviction, such desperation, offered a glimmer of hope, a flicker of reassurance in the midst of the darkness. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But the doubt, the suspicion, was a serpent's whisper that poisoned her thoughts. "But you used her villa," she said, her voice cold, accusing. "You knew it was hers. You knew the risk. You led us there." He nodded, his head bowed, his shoulders slumping. "I did," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I thought it was the safest place. I thought I could keep you safe there. I was wrong." His admission, his confession of his own fallibility, his own mistakes, softened her anger, her hurt. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the desperation. She saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had risked everything for her, the man who was now, like her, trapped in a web of deceit and danger. "What do we do now, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice softer now, her anger replaced by a weary resignation, a shared sense of vulnerability. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. He knew, as she did, that they were running out of time, that their enemies were closing in, that their options were dwindling. "We fight," he said, his voice firm, resolute, the Kimura prince resurfacing, the warrior taking control. "We fight for our lives. We fight for our future. We fight for us." He reached for the gun, the small, deadly weapon he had packed in the bag. He checked the ammunition, his movements swift and practiced, his face grim and determined. Francesca watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had never held a gun, had never even seen one up close. She had always abhorred violence, had always sought refuge in peace, in beauty, in the quiet solitude of her gardens. But now, she realized there was no escape. There was only survival. And she would do whatever it took to survive, to protect herself, to protect the man she loved. Suddenly a noise. A distant rumble, growing louder, closer. Headlights, piercing the darkness, sweeping across the clearing. They were found. Lorenzo grabbed her hand, his grip tight, urgent. "Come on," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "We have to go.
Now."
He pulled her from the car, into the darkness, into the night. They ran, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth, their hearts pounding in unison, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, closer. Gunshots, echoing through the night, shattering the silence, punctuating the darkness. Fire and blood, the inevitable collision of their warring worlds. The horizon was ablaze, and they were running straight into the flames. A reckoning was coming. Chapter 17. The Ghosts of Vows Unspoken. They ran through the dense olive grove, the branches whipping at their faces, the thorns tearing at their clothes. The sounds of pursuit were relentless, the gunshots echoing closer, the shouts of their pursuers a terrifying chorus in the darkness. Lorenzo led the way, his pace swift and sure, his hand gripping Francesca's, pulling her along, guiding her through the treacherous terrain. He knew these hills, these woods, had roamed them since childhood, had learned to hunt, to hide, to survive in this wild, unforgiving landscape. Francesca stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She was not used to this, to running, to hiding, to the constant, throbbing fear that threatened to consume her. "Lorenzo," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper, "I can't go on." He stopped, his eyes searching hers, his face etched with concern, with determination. He saw the exhaustion, the fear, the despair. "We have to," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're almost there. Just a little further." Almost where? What was their destination? What was his plan? She didn't know, didn't dare to ask. She could only trust him, follow him, cling to the hope that he could somehow, miraculously, save them. They continued their desperate flight, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. They could hear the voices of their pursuers, the unmistakable Neapolitan dialect, harsh and menacing. Suddenly, Lorenzo stopped, pulling Francesca behind a large, ancient olive tree, its gnarled trunk providing a meager shield. He pressed his finger to his lips, signaling for silence. They waited, their bodies pressed together, their hearts pounding in unison, their breath held captive in their lungs. They could hear the footsteps of their pursuers, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, closer, ever closer. Francesca closed her eyes, her mind racing, her body trembling. She thought of her family, of Salvatore, of Marco, of the life she had left behind. She thought of the gilded cage, the suffocating expectations, the quiet desperation that had driven her into Lorenzo's arms. She thought of Lorenzo, of the forbidden kiss, of the stolen moments, of the dangerous love that had blossomed in the darkness. She thought of the villa, the trap, the betrayal, the secrets that had been revealed. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with Lorenzo's. She saw the fear in his eyes, the determination, the love. She saw the man he was, the man he had tried to be, the man he might become. The footsteps were almost upon them. They could hear the voices, the whispers, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Lorenzo reached for his own gun, the small, deadly weapon he had carried with him, his only defense against the overwhelming odds. He looked at Francesca, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. "I love you, Francesca," he said, his voice a low, fervent whisper, a vow spoken in the face of death, a promise that might never be fulfilled. The words, spoken with such raw emotion, such desperate sincerity, pierced her heart. It was the first time he had said those words, the first time he had openly declared his love, without reservation, without hesitation. "I love you too, Lorenzo," she whispered back, her voice choked with unshed tears, her heart filled with a love that defied the darkness, that transcended the fear, that burned bright in the face of oblivion. The vows, unspoken for so long, finally uttered. And then a voice.
Sharp, cold, familiar.
There they are. Isabella. Her red hair was like a flame in the darkness. The ghosts of the past had arrived. And there would be a reckoning. Chapter 18. Shattered Reflections of the Past. Isabella stood at the edge of the clearing, her figure illuminated by the flickering light of torches carried by the men behind her. Her emerald green eyes, usually sharp and assessing, were now blazing with a mixture of fury and triumph. Her red hair, unbound and wild, framed her face like a halo of fire. She held a gun in her hand, a small, silver pistol that glinted menacingly in the torchlight. It was pointed directly at Francesca. "Well, well, well," Isabella said, her voice smooth and melodious, but laced with a venomous undertone. "Look what we have here. The runaway bride and her Camorra prince. How romantic." Lorenzo stepped in front of Francesca, shielding her with his body, his own gun raised, his eyes fixed on Isabella, his expression a mixture of defiance and something else. Something that looked like pity. "Isabella," he said, his voice calm and controlled, but with an underlying steeliness that was unmistakable. "Let her go. This is between you and me." Isabella laughed, a cold, brittle sound that echoed through the clearing. "Between you and me?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, Lorenzo, you always were so naive. This is about everything. About family, about loyalty, about power." She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing, her gaze shifting from Lorenzo to Francesca, her expression filled with a mixture of hatred and contempt. "You," she said, her voice hissing like a snake, her finger tightening on the trigger of her gun.
"You stole him from me.
You ruined everything." Francesca felt a wave of fear wash over her, but she stood her ground, refusing to cower before Isabella's wrath. She met her gaze directly, her own eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and sadness. "I didn't steal anything, Isabella," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "Lorenzo made his own choice." Isabella's eyes flashed with anger. "Choice?" she spat. "He had no choice. He was mine. He was promised to me."
"Promised."
The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. A pact, an agreement, a bond forged between families, a transaction that had nothing to do with love, with desire, with free will. Lorenzo lowered his gun slightly, his expression softening, his gaze shifting to Isabella, his voice losing its harshness. "Isabella," he said, his voice pleading, almost gentle. "It was never like that. You know it. It was an arrangement. A business deal. It was never love." Isabella's face contorted with rage, her eyes blazing with a fury that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. She raised her gun again, her hand trembling, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Liar!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the clearing. "You loved me. You belonged to me." She fired. The gunshot cracked through the silence. But the bullet did not hit Francesca, did not reach its intended target. Lorenzo, with a speed that defied belief, had pushed Francesca aside, throwing himself in front of her, taking the bullet meant for her. He gasped, his body jerking, his eyes widening in shock, in pain. He staggered, his hand clutching his chest, a crimson stain spreading across his white shirt. Francesca screamed, her voice a raw, primal cry of anguish, of despair. She rushed to his side, her hands reaching for him, trying to hold him, to support him, to stop the bleeding. "Lorenzo!" she cried, her voice choked with sobs, her tears streaming down her cheeks.
No, no, no.
He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound escaped his lips. Isabella stood frozen, her gun still raised, her face a mask of shock, of horror, of disbelief. She had not meant to shoot Lorenzo, had not intended to kill him. Her rage, her jealousy, her desperation had blinded her, had driven her to an act of violence that had shattered everything, that had destroyed the very thing she had sought to possess. The men behind her, Lorenzo's men, her men, stood motionless, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and judgment. They had witnessed the scene, the betrayal, the violence, the tragic consequences of a love triangle, of a feud that had spiraled out of control. The past lay shattered, like a broken mirror, reflecting distorted images of love, loyalty, and betrayal. The reflection was painful to watch. Chapter 19. The Heart's Final Stand. Francesca cradled Lorenzo's body in her arms, her tears mingling with the blood that stained his shirt, her sobs echoing through the silent clearing. She pressed her hands against his wound, trying desperately to stem the flow of blood, to keep him alive, to hold onto the fragile thread of his existence. "Lorenzo, please," she whispered, her voice choked with anguish, her heart breaking with each labored breath he took. "Stay with me. Please. Don't leave me." He looked at her, his eyes, once so vibrant, so full of life, now clouded with pain, with weakness, with the encroaching darkness. He tried to speak, but only a faint, gurgling sound escaped his lips. He reached out, his hand trembling, his fingers brushing against her cheek, wiping away a tear. His touch, once so strong, so possessive, was now weak, fragile, fleeting. "Francesca," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Love you." His hand fell limp, his eyes closed, his body went still. He was gone. Francesca screamed, a raw, primal scream of grief, of despair, of a love lost, a future shattered, a dream extinguished. She clung to his lifeless body, her sobs shaking her frame, her tears soaking his blood-stained shirt. The clearing was silent, the sounds of pursuit, the gunshots, the shouts, all faded into a distant, muffled hum. The only sound was Francesca's heartbreaking sobs, her cries of anguish, her lament for a love that had been, for a future that would never be. Isabella stood frozen, her gun still clutched in her hand, her face a mask of horror, of disbelief, of remorse. She had not meant to kill Lorenzo, had not intended to destroy the man she had claimed to love. Her jealousy, her rage, her desperation had blinded her, had driven her to an act of violence that had shattered everything, that had left her alone, with nothing but the bitter taste of regret, of guilt, of a love lost forever. The men who had accompanied her, Lorenzo's men, her men, stood motionless, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and judgment. They had witnessed the scene, the betrayal, the violence, the tragic consequences of a feud that had consumed them all. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons, their heads bowed, their shoulders slumping. They turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Isabella alone with her grief, with her guilt, with the shattered remnants of her ambition. Francesca remained, cradling Lorenzo's body, her tears flowing unchecked, her heart broken beyond repair. She didn't know how long she stayed there, lost in her grief, oblivious to the world around her. Then, she felt a hand on her shoulder, a gentle touch, a familiar presence.
Marco.
He stood beside her, his face etched with sorrow, with regret, with a profound sadness that mirrored her own. He had followed them, had tracked them, had arrived too late to save Lorenzo, too late to prevent the tragedy. Francesca, he said, his voice soft, tender, filled with a compassion she had rarely seen in him.
Come home.
It's over. She looked at him, her eyes red and swollen, her face streaked with tears and blood. She shook her head, her grip tightening on Lorenzo's body. No, she whispered, her voice hoarse, broken. I won't leave him. Marco knelt beside her, his hand reaching out, his fingers gently stroking her hair, his touch a silent offering of comfort, of solace. He's gone, Francesca, he said, his voice choked with emotion. There's nothing more you can do. She knew he was right, knew that Lorenzo was gone, that her love, her dream, her future had been extinguished. But she couldn't let go, couldn't abandon him, couldn't leave him alone in this cold, dark clearing. She felt a final resolve, a determination to protect him, the only thing she could do now. Then help me, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands, a new strength surging through her veins. Help me give him the burial he deserves. Away from all of this. Marco looked at his sister. She was not the same woman. She was heartbroken, but also reborn. He nodded. The heart's final stand was to honor the fallen and to rise from the ashes. Chapter 20. A legacy forged in flames. The burial was a quiet, private affair, held at dawn on a secluded hillside overlooking the sea. There were no grand pronouncements, no elaborate rituals, no representatives from the warring families. Just Francesca, Marco, and a handful of trusted men who had served Lorenzo, men who had witnessed his final act of bravery, his ultimate sacrifice. They buried him beneath an ancient olive tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky like outstretched arms, its roots firmly planted in the earth, a symbol of strength, of resilience, of enduring life. The rising sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, illuminating the scene with a soft, ethereal light, a promise of hope, of renewal, of a new day dawning. Francesca stood beside the grave, her heart heavy with grief, but also filled with a newfound sense of purpose, of determination. She had lost Lorenzo, had lost the man she loved, the future she had dreamed of, but she had also found something within herself, a strength, a courage, a resilience she had never known she possessed. She had shed the gilded cage, the suffocating expectations, the quiet desperation that had defined her life for so long. She had tasted freedom, had experienced a love that defied the boundaries of her world, a love that had transformed her, that had awakened her spirit, that had forged a new legacy, a legacy of defiance, of courage, of unwavering commitment. Marco stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent offering of support, of solidarity. He had changed too, his hardened exterior softened by grief, by regret, by the realization that the old ways, the ancient feuds, the relentless pursuit of power had brought nothing but pain, but destruction, but loss. What will you do now, Francesca? He asked, his voice low and gentle, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. She looked at him, her gaze steady, her expression resolute. I will live, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. I will live for him. I will live for myself. I will live for the future we dreamed of, a future free from violence, from hatred, from the shadows of the past. She turned and looked at the grave, at the simple wooden cross that marked Lorenzo's final resting place. She reached out, her hand touching the rough-hewn wood, her fingers tracing the inscription she had chosen, a single word, amore, love. The force that had driven them, that had sustained them, that had ultimately destroyed them, but also that had transformed them, that had set them free. She would carry that love with her, always, a reminder of the man she had lost, of the future they had dreamed of the legacy she would build in his name. She would leave Naples, leave the Camorra, leave the world of violence and betrayal behind. She would use the knowledge she had gained, the connections she had made, the resources she possessed, to create something new, something better, something that honored Lorenzo's memory, that fulfilled his vision of a different world. She would start a foundation, a sanctuary for women like her, women trapped in gilded cages, women seeking freedom, seeking empowerment, seeking a life beyond the constraints of tradition, of expectation, of violence. She would call it Il Sogno di Lorenzo's dream. It would be a place of hope, of healing, of transformation, a place where women could find their voice, discover their strength, create their own destiny. It would be a legacy forged in flames, a testament to the power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring hope for a better future. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm, golden rays upon the hillside, upon the grave, upon Francesca, upon Marco, upon the men who stood silently beside them. A new day had dawned. A new legacy had begun. The flames had done their worst, but from them, a phoenix had risen. And while she knew that the scars would always remain, Francesca was not afraid. She was ready. Epilogue. 10 years later. The Tuscan sun warmed Francesca's face as she walked through the vibrant rows of the vineyard, her fingers gently brushing against the ripening grapes. The air was filled with the sweet scent of the fruit, the buzzing of bees, and the distant laughter of children playing in the courtyard of the sprawling villa.
Il sogno di Lorenzo ed flourished.
It was no longer just a sanctuary for women escaping the suffocating grip of the Camorra, but a thriving community, a testament to resilience, to hope, to the transformative power of love and second chances. The villa, once a symbol of a broken dream, was now a beacon of light, a place where women from all walks of life came to heal, to learn, to grow, to build new lives for themselves and their families. Francesca had kept her promise. She had left the darkness behind, had embraced the light, had created a legacy that honored Lorenzo's memory, that fulfilled his vision of a better world. She had found peace, not the quiet, suffocating peace of a gilded cage, but the vibrant, dynamic peace of a life lived fully, authentically, with purpose and passion. She had not forgotten Lorenzo. His memory was a constant presence in her life, a guiding star, a source of strength, a reminder of the love that had transformed her, that had set her free. She wore a small, silver locket around her neck, a gift from him, containing a single, dried rose from the Amalfi coast, a tangible reminder of their brief, stolen moments of happiness, of the dream they had shared. She had found love again, too. Not the passionate, all-consuming love she had shared with Lorenzo, but a gentler, more mature love, a love born of friendship, of respect, of shared values. Alessandro, a local vintner, a widower with kind eyes and a gentle soul, had slowly, patiently won her heart. He understood her past, respected her scars, embraced her vision. He was her partner, her companion, her friend, her lover. He was not Lorenzo, but he was good. And Francesca had learned that sometimes good was enough. Sometimes good was everything. Marco visited often, his visits a bridge between her past and her present. He had changed, too, transformed by grief, by remorse, by the realization that the old ways had brought nothing but destruction. He had distanced himself from the Camorra, had dedicated his life to supporting Francesca's work, to protecting Il Sogno di Lorenzo, to atoning for the sins of his family. Isabella was a ghost, a shadow from a past that Francesca had left behind. She had heard rumors, whispers of Isabella's descent into madness, of her isolation, of her relentless pursuit of a revenge that would never be realized. Francesca felt no hatred for her, only pity, a profound sadness for a woman consumed by jealousy, by ambition, by a love that had turned toxic, that had destroyed everything it had touched. As Francesca reached the end of the vineyard row, she paused, her gaze sweeping across the breathtaking panorama of rolling hills, sun-drenched fields, and the distant, shimmering expanse of the sea. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sweet, fragrant air. She was content. She was at peace. She had lived, she had loved, she had lost, she had learned. She had survived. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the horizon, on the promise of a new day, of a future filled with hope, with possibility, with the enduring legacy of a love that had defied the darkness, that had blossomed in the flames, that had transformed her, that had set her free. The dream had survived, and the legacy would endure. It would continue, through all the women, through all the lives, that Il Sogno di Lorenzo touched. It was complete.